So I've been teaching myself Unreal Engine 5 over these past few months, and I'm making a short horror game as I learn. It's based off of a section of my second D&D campaign that I created, and as I'm learning Unreal, I'm using everything that I'm learning to try to make it as accurate as possible. While on the side, I'm planning and experimenting with creating a full-fledged game. Today I was going to work on the endings, and my god, the longer I worked on it, the more dumb I became, and the more chaotic and broken the endings became. What should have been a quick, simple, like 40 minutes of code or so turned into a 4-hour coding adventure because my brain decided to take a rain check today.
Am I just naming everything wrong? What do you mean there's already one that exists? Right. I'll go. For this part, I was making two endings. One of them is an ending for completing the game itself, and the other ending I'm trying to make as canon as I can to the campaign that I wrote, with the way to get it being to follow the same steps as in the campaign. I started with wanting to move the non-canon exit because I thought that its location was a little bit too hard to reach and was too much effort to get to for what it was. So I looked around the maze thinking of where else I could move it, but there weren't a whole lot of options as to where I could put it. I wanted to put in the true ending that's canon with my D&D campaign, so I'm putting that exit where the first exit was. Since it's a secret ending, I think that its difficulty is on par with the rest of the stuff that you have to do to get to it. After looking around the maze, I couldn't think of where to put the other exit that wouldn't be super easy, but would also need a more direct route to get to. I didn't want it to be reachable from all sides, so like if you go in any direction of the maze, you're going to reach it. So I put that on hold and decided that I'd come back to it later. In the meantime, I went back to the UI, writing more notes that could be found around the map, which would reveal the lore and clues. The way that the notes work is that I have a collision box around the physical model of the note itself, so when the player steps within that box, it sends a signal to the note's code, basically checking to see what entered the box. And if it sees that the player is what entered the box, then it enables input from the player. And that way, if the player hits E, they're able to interact with the note. On interacting with it, a signal is sent to the UI that I made, which then displays the note's text. The code to the note changes the player's movement mode to nothing, meaning that the player can't receive any movement inputs, as well as displaying the text on the screen. I went about making a handful more notes that the player could find for lore and secret hints, and then I resized and relocated some of the inventory UI to make it look a bit more clean since I didn't like how clumped up it was. I want to say that I did something more interesting during this time, but all it was really just me writing notes and doing the same code over and over and over to display the note's text, to get rid of the note's text when the player is done reading it, fixing the inventory UI to look better, and also adding some UI to a few new items. Next up, it was time to code the keys. It wouldn't be hard since it was more or less the same code that I did for the locked doors. The hard part was going to be coding the system that receives the keys, which would have to be the same type of system that I made for a different puzzle, the bird puzzle. About a month or so prior, I was working on a puzzle that involved a bird, and after 5 hours of trial and error, as well as dragging another friend who knows how to code into my room to help, we ended up with a puzzle that did not work correctly. Well, not entirely. It worked, but only if you did it in a very specific way, and I was so done with it that I just redid parts of the game. That way there was no other way to solve the puzzle other than doing the way that worked. I say worked when in reality I mean the way that had the least amount of errors pop up when running it. I got it down to just 3 errors from the original 20, but those 3 errors didn't really seem to affect the gameplay that much, so it's best just to ignore them, I hope. Anyway, the thing I had to do that receives the keys was basically making that all over again. And I was not going through that nightmare again, so I straight up just copy and pasted that puzzle and just switched the models to the ones that pertain to the true ending keys. Sure, the errors would pop up, but I'd ignored those errors with the first puzzle, and I damn well was going to ignore them a second time. Now, back to the keys. The actual hard part was my brain completely forgetting the difference between left and right. The right side key, I kept on typing in left in my code and making all my variables labeled as left when the code was rigged to control the right side. Eventually, I got them all named correctly, so then it was time to work on the left half. And guess what? I did the same damn thing, except this time I also for some reason used the model that I had made for the right side. So I had basically created the right side all over again entirely, model and all, but it was linked to the left side. When I realized this, I went back and changed the left model and the code to the left, but then I forgot which piece I was working on and didn't realize that I had started to code the right side key thinking it was the left. This went on for like 30 minutes, but I had mixed up the right and left models, variables, labels, and code so many times that I no longer knew which one was meant to be which. I had the left key with the model of the right key, with the code to send the signal to the left key slot, except the signal would be sent from the right key, which also had the right key model, but would send code to the right side door. but now the right side door was labeled as left but functioning as the right. After a few minutes of slamming my face into the keyboard, I finally got it all sorted out and proceeded to put each of the keys in their respective places. And then I realized that I had just placed the right key down twice. When I finally got everything right, it was time to go back to working on the canon exit to the maze. I found a new location to put the non-canon ending and marked its old location for where the canon ending would go. I quickly modeled out a pedestal that the keys would fit into and attached the code that I had made earlier to it. Then I decided it was time for bed because I didn't want to deal with my left and right anymore, and I knew that continuing on the canon exit would require more of that. Next up, I got to working on making it so that what the keys open actually opens. Currently, if you use the key, it would be, well, used. And the game would say that the path is open, but I hadn't actually coded in the opening sequence yet, so it was sequence time. Slapping together two quick sequences, I made it so that when the key was used, the exit path would fire off a small animation depending on which key was used, and the animations were connected to what I'm going to refer to as exit doors. Now, in the actual campaign I had wrote, the exit was a dangling rope ladder that would fall from a sealed hatch and connect to the outside world, and I had not gone too deep into learning how to use skeletal meshes yet. My main expertise had been with static meshes, so I didn't know how to make a convincing looking rope ladder. So I went with a normal ladder instead. I still wanted to keep the whole climbing to freedom kind of thing, so I coded it that when you get close to the ladder, it increases the player's step height, which in relatable terms just means that I made it so instead of going up the stairs one at a time, it goes up like 50 steps in one step. I had to make a few adjustments to the ladder itself so that the player could actually go up it instead of just instantly teleporting to the top. I added that to the exit area and lined it up with the exit doors so that when a key was used, you can go up the ladder a bit further but not be able to make it to the top unless both keys are used. Modeling out a sort of pit tunnel thing, I attached that to the ceiling of the area to make it feel as though you were climbing out of rocks to escape. And a lot of unnecessary collision box editing later, I was satisfied with my work. I'd realized that I made the exit doors a little too small for what I wanted, so I rescaled them to 5 times their size. Or so I thought. See, the models for the doors were the correct size, but in the animation sequence, it worked by setting a new location, scale, and rotation. So I had to make sure that the animation's scale, location, and rotation were the same as the models. So I did that, and when I went to test it, I was confused as to why the doors weren't opening. I tried a few more times thinking it was like just a fluke, but it just continued to not open. I added a print string to the code, which would notify me if the code worked. So when I tried it again, the print string fired off and made text appear on the screen that basically just said that it was working as intended. So I had no clue why it wasn't actually working. That was until I double checked the scale. Remember when I said that the location, scale, and rotation had to be the same in both the model and the animation? Well, I didn't realize that in the animation I'd set it to 50 times the size instead of 5 times the size. So when the model itself was sitting in the world, it would be normal sized, but when the animation triggered, it would scale it up to 50 times its size to the point where the animation wasn't even noticeable. You think I would have noticed it sooner if the exit door suddenly grew massive in size, but since I had made the pit tunnel and put it on top so you can actually climb out, it blocked my line of sight to the area around me, so I wasn't actually able to see that the exit doors had grown massive. When all that was said and done, I added some quick permanent text to the non-canon exit to make it a bit more noticeable, and then I had to stop to head off to class. Since most of the big chunks of coding I'd done earlier in the project, I was left with mostly modeling and doing some small things. So when I got back from class, I spent a bit of time remodeling the pedestal itself that you put the keys into, as well as the cave area around the true ending exit to make it look and feel more natural. I had then forgotten that I'd already done the collisions for the rocks there, and that I had deemed it unnecessary earlier in that day, and I went about doing the exact same thing all over again before realizing, once again, there was no need to make collisions for them if the player would never actually be able to touch them, and that they were just for environmental decoration. Then I decided that I wanted the escape credits to be more interesting, so I began to work on a whole end credit sequence and area for it to play out in. I spent a few hours getting this started, but I'll save that stuff for the next video, since at this time I'm still working on it, and I'd like to have the next devlog be the entire section rather than it being broken up and mashed into multiple videos.